anytime you're calling an async function based on some user interaction, you should try a transition. And it's probably going to be easier and it's going to be better.
Hello, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Noel, and today we have Aurora Scharff, Senior Consultant at Crayon Consulting, here to talk about modern React patterns, concurrent rendering, actions, and what's next. In this episode, Aurora and I talk about making apps feel more responsive, some common patterns for concurrency, and how this plays in with common frameworks. So here's our episode with Aurora. Welcome to PodRocket, Aurora. Before we kind of get into stuff too much here, can we just kind of talk a little bit about what from a high level, what are some of these concurrent features that we're talking about, and what's the problem we're really addressing here? Is there a specific UI kind of quirk we see that these are trying to help us with?
So thank you for having me on the show. This is very exciting.
Yeah.
Well, there's a bunch of different concurrent features that a lot of them came out in React 18, but we're now seeing more of them kind of work together with some of the newer features in 19. So first of all, we have useTransition, which lets us mark a set of state updates as a lower priority update, which then all execute at the same time once the transition completes. And then it can be interrupted by high priority updates like inputs and clicks, and it provides a built-in pending state. So this is useful both for rendering optimization from React 18 version and also async calls in 19.
What's an example? I think it's easier, especially when people don't have a visual, to have something concrete right away. Because I guess in my head, I was just looking at the docs and looking at examples, but when I hear about these things, I'm always my impulse is always well, I don't know if I typically feel this, because if I'm using a text input with a search box, I've already got some there's an async thing that happens there, but I'm waiting for the results to come back anyway. I'm usually not blocking input. When does this actually become a problem?
So we have two kind of versions of this. You have the rendering optimization version, which is just, okay, let's say you have some slow components or a bunch of slow components that is actually blocking your rendering. You can mark the state update going to trigger this slow component becoming visible as a transition, which means it's lower priority and you won't block the page when this is happening. And you can get away from that and see, for example, let's say you have a tab. The tab has this expensive component. It's slow. It's going to block your clicks around in the tab. If it's a transition, that means that we don't have that blocking, and we can see while it's pending that it's pending.
I'm zooming out maybe a little more than you probably do kind of in this discussion typically. But are there tools you find helpful to kind of figure out which of these components are actually blocking, when you step into a site or when you're working on one?
I think at least now with the compiler and everything, you don't really encounter this, hey, I should optimize this. It's more hey, this is actually not working. I need to fix it. So luckily we're in the state where we don't need to look for things to optimize, rather just fix them when they occur. So that's the one part of it. But with React 19, we also have the async transitions, which is just more useful for tracking the state of some sort of async function.
Gotcha. What does that look like? Have you found starting to use transition to feel pretty intuitive, or have you found that it kind of opens up your workflow at all?
For sure, definitely tracking an async call is just you're used to doing set loading true, do the await or call the function, set it to false, maybe catch the error, fix some state depending on what happened. You have this normal flow, and that whole flow is just simplified into a transition. So for sure, when you start trying this version of useTransition, you just simplify a lot of your workflow, and you don't have to do this manual state updates every time you're talking to the server.
For people listening at home, especially those that aren't writing a lot of React, maybe they're just in another framework. What does that actually look like? We can focus on useTransition specifically, because I think that's probably the easiest to kind of
the syntax.
What is it functionally? How does it differ from using a loading state like you explained a second ago?
Well, it's a hook. It returns a pending flag, and it returns a function to start a transition, and then you put whatever state updates and async calls you're going to execute inside that transition, and then you get the pending state, and that's it. And it's going to be synced to the async call and execute at the end of the async call. So you have this very smooth, it's in transition, this very smooth transition where there's no like weird flickers or states that update not when the API actually gave you the response, those things.
Are there any kind of common traps that devs fall into, or maybe that you fell into, in kind of making this transition? Because I feel like we're so mentally trained into this, like using loading state explicitly and managing. Like, is there any kind of like, oh, I don't need to do this anymore, or aha moments here when converting to some of these newer hooks?
Yeah, I think anytime you're calling an async function based on some user interaction, you should try a transition, and it's probably going to be easier and it's going to be better.
I feel often in React apps we have this kind of flow where like we try to always structure things well, but we end up in this mode where there's like an input like 7 layers down in some component here, and then like that needs to go like up 4 layers and then down 3 more and like change something here. Is this do you find that those kinds of like kind of gross hierarchies are harder or more difficult to manage in this kind of async rendering world, where this is put on the dev to kind of think about a little bit more, but then it's handled more nicely? Or do you think that it's like that plumbing is kind of the same amount of difficulty either way?
I think maybe it depends on how you build your apps, and if you're using a framework, a lot of that, or some sort of library that's handling more of that work for you, it would not be that complex. So it definitely depends on what framework or what library you're using to build your apps.
In that framework case, is it difficult to transition older apps that are built like pretty framework dependent, like they're pretty built? Is it difficult to kind of transition them into this async world, like with React 19?
You could say that it's you're building your app one way, now you have a arguably better way to build it.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not worth refactoring things, but just getting in the right mindset and seeing the alternatives as you keep on building is a good bet.
Do you have any experience here, like in kind of doing that conversion, like you're reopening an old project for the first time and being like, oh, some of this stuff should be async? I feel the thing that always happens there is you're like, well, there's all these patterns here. Like I'm introducing new complexity. I don't want devs to have to think about 2 different things. How do you make that decision? When is it enough to be like, okay, we should probably actually use async hooks here?
I did actually experience this recently. I was like helping another project just to review their best practices, and you definitely see a lot of cases where you could maybe have done this instead of this, but that doesn't mean you have to go and change it. But just knowing about what patterns in your code base could be done differently, I think that's a realization that makes you easier see those patterns in the future.
It would be helpful to talk a little bit about like what those patterns are. Like, is there anything in the way? I'm thinking largely in terms of like managing these large projects to make it easier for devs to kind of step in and get into this headspace of like, oh, we have useTransition, we have useOptimistic now. Are there any kind of like conventions or anything you recommend to help devs like kind of follow that and understand what's going on at a glance when they look at a given component a little bit more easily?
Well, I think with these new features, like combining the concurrent ones from 18 and the 19 features, they kind of explain themselves. So once you see useOptimistic, you know what it does, and then combining that with naming conventions that explain the behavior of something, that will be going to tell you how that interaction behaves.
Gotcha. What's like an example of that? What have you seen works particularly well as far as naming conventions, like in a component?
Yeah, so let's talk about the form component. So the React 19 form component, they released this version of the form in 19, which is like, it's like building on top of the HTML form. So the HTML form, the default one is like you have a form, action, and then a route, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now it can also take in a function. So you have 2 versions to call something on your form submission. And that's very clear because of the naming convention. And an action is a certain way, or a transition function is a certain way, and then your onSubmit is a different way. So that's an example of, in practice, what that looks like. And you would understand the behavior based on the property.
I think it's hard to even discuss this without like getting into the specifics of server side rendering a little bit. Did you know where I was going with that question? Like everyone, I feel like everyone is like we get into this mode. We have so many. There's so many concerns now. It feels like it's like this is all so much more complicated than it was a little bit. And like, I mean, I think there's varying opinions on how well the React team has like made this transition, or I guess like the Next team a little bit. But like, how have you found it? Have you found these hooks to be easy to kind of have in more like server rendered apps, easy to use in more server rendered apps, or is there like, back to my prior question, are there like cases where this can be tricky when it's hard, when you're not explicitly thinking about where the rendering is going to occur for a given component?
So this is more regarding the server side. Of course, we're going to talk about like Next.js and frameworks, but at least for example, for Next.js, it's built around these features in a way that it just kind of naturally becomes the solution that you need. Whereas maybe in a different framework, let's say React or v7, they already have different or established patterns. Maybe you're not going to feel the need of the new patterns as much because you already have alternatives. But Next.js really integrates with this whole concurrent and async view, because that's the way it's built, right?
Right.
So it's already built around around suspense and such.
Yeah, I guess like, can you not think of any cases where any of these, even like when just learning due to kind of like lack of knowledge, where the new like async hooks are, maybe do something unexpected or just like are tricky when dealing with server side rendering?
When they're tricky when dealing with server side rendering.
Yeah, like are there any cases at all that are just like, oh yeah, this component is like, on the like, this one is actually client side and I'd forgotten about that, and I have to like I have this concern here where I don't typically have it, or the inverse of like, oh, this is like a server side render, but there's like a child here that's like only able to be rendered in the client. Is there any weirdness here with like those kinds of like the gap between the two?
And now we're getting into the whole server component story, which is like a whole nother thing, which I'm purposely trying to like keep away from my upcoming talk at React Universe, because I know it's difficult and people are like, oh, I don't want to think about that right now, and that's why I'm like trying to focus more on the client version and usages of this. But definitely there are some things that like, what, why is okay, because you put it in this pattern now you cannot no longer use it in this way. Yeah, but I think that's a lot to go into right now, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's what. Yeah, like I think that those like, yeah, it's like it can be so tough to balance that, and like the set of concerns is slightly different, right? Because like you're flipping the whole like the problem with asynchronicity is kind of like pushed into a different domain when you're in that world. But
it's
like,
very different.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that it'll be fine, but I think it's tricky right now, especially when we're already in this state of like having to kind of balance mentally like what's going on there. But like
it's a learning curve, for sure.
Yeah, I guess. But like to kind of to pull us back a little bit, you mentioned that there's like in your talk, you said that some of the inspiration were from some like good examples you've seen online. Is there anything you'd point devs to look at to kind of just like get good, like have a good baseline of how some of these new async hooks can work?
Well, what I've noticed reading a lot of documentation is the React documentation now, even the ones for rendering optimization, like useTransition, use deferred value, are largely focused on the async and the data fetching approach, where you would suspend something and then handle a specific behavior. So I think just reading the documentation, and they have these really good code sandboxes, right? So if you haven't been exploring the docs much, maybe you haven't really dug into them, but for every sort of concept, there's a code sandbox. And then what you can do is you can read it, but even better, just click fork and then try it. And you will see that there's more implementation details that maybe weren't so clear to you just by seeing the example itself, where when you open it and you get to see the whole code, you can really play with it and maybe get some inspiration for your own projects. And then for sure, applying that on, maybe you have like a case in your head, maybe I could use it here, in this exact component, and then trying it. That's a great way to learn, I think.
I agree. It's easier to like break stuff. You can introduce like artificial delays and all that stuff that a little bit more
Lots.
easily. Yeah. So I feel like that was it's kind of like it can kind of be tough, especially if you're trying to be proactive about it. Like you said earlier, we notice this is a problem like when it's happening, right? Like when we're doing it. But there's always the impulse. It's like, well, yeah, but I'm like sitting here on some nice, a brand new $1,100 MacBook or something. Like, I feel like a lot of this is happening when a user's on a cell phone going through a tunnel in a car or something. It's like, this is when I really care about the app, not becoming a stuttery mess. So I think it can be easier to see that kind of stuff there. Is there like, are there specific approaches here to use these to use the new hooks and like get them into the correct kind of place in the component hierarchy? Going back to my prior question of like having like trying to keep track. You found that there to be good when trying to be more proactive like this. Is there a good kind of level of zoom here that you find to put, like where to put like a useOptimistic call? Like you typically err on the side of having it higher up or like very low near where the slow piece of a given component tree might be?
So that's a great question. And I think there's been some, maybe some confusion about this. So the way I think about it is all of these are something you typically do locally in a component.
Yeah.
And it's for that component. And if you're doing something bigger, maybe like, let's say you're doing this CRUD or something and you want it optimistic, maybe you're actually not doing useOptimistic, you're using React Query, something like that. So it's really good for these local components that have some sort of very, simple concern in the component itself that you can now solve combining transitions with useOptimistic. Let's say you have like, I did this example, like you have a save to save product to favorites, on some sort of shopping website. Yeah. It's just a simple, very small button, but just having a quick interaction there. And then afterwards firing the actual update, it's just like one line of code and it's concerned for the component only. Yeah. Those cases, or like a favorite, if you have like a simple click that just needs to feel interactive.
Are those cases ever particularly problematic? Because I feel like historically the impulse is always just like, if you're in the useOptimistic, then you just like make a call, like a web call, and you just like don't await it. And you're like, it'll be fine. Like this will probably work. That's like, I'm gonna fire this off and assume everything is okay. But like, there's the like the desire to have that, like I want to make this as good as I can.
Yeah.
And like if something goes wrong, I can err. Are there clean ways? Because I feel like what should typically happen in those cases, just from a UX standpoint, it's hard to map this to everything, but like it's like simply like I want to do the thing and like let the user get on with their day. Yeah. But then like if something goes wrong, I don't want them to like completely lose. Like I could just display an error message, but that's not going to be super helpful. Have you found useOptimistic is helpful, or I guess any of these hooks is helpful to like kind of get the user back to a point where they can do the thing again without completely blocking until the result comes back?
So I think what we can do to understand that is just to recap what useOptimistic does differently from other hooks, because it is kind of a weird one. And so what's special here is, first of all, it must be called inside a transition, and then you have this create an optimistic state that only exists while this transition is completing. So let's say we have this save to my favorites for a product. Yeah. This you can call useOptimistic and set is saved true. And then it's only going to exist for as long as that async call completing the save to favorites is still ongoing. Yeah. And after it's done, it will automatically sync to the real value. So that means that it's just, you have a click, it's instant, it probably is fine. You don't see any weird state updates, it's just clean. But in the case that something went wrong, it reverts or it it feels like it rolls back, but it's just rolling back to the initial past value, which is now from the truth from the server or from some other source.
Yeah. Are there particular kind of patterns here from like an API perspective? Like let's say you control the backend and the front end. Is there like is it does this kind of does the API of the hook itself, does that more easily like lend itself to specific ways of designing front end back end interactions? Like is it better to, you know, like be returning generally a larger like state object than from these calls that kind of can more easily be reapplied to the front end to instruct it how to render? Or can we like still have very atomic small actions that are like acting on one piece of data? Because I think both have their pros and cons historically, but when we're in this mode of wanting to be able to like recover cleanly, is there like have you found the way that useOptimistic is structured kind of pushes you one direction or the other?
Well, it just falls back to the real value on failure, or you could say the fail value, wherever it gets its data from, that's what it's going to fall back to. So you don't need to like return anything. It comes from the data source.
Yeah.
So definitely like an automatic, you can think of it like an automatic rollback, but it's not really a rollback. It's just discarding some state.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like a good example here where I've kind of run into this problem in the past, where like I'm thinking in things where like you'd expect this submit to like change other state elsewhere, so you like do kind of hacky stuff on the client to be like, oh, it'll probably look like this like when they're done, and then you're like, oh no, wait, like if this fails, I then also
Exactly.
so then you end up in this weird mode where you're like trying to like get computed state to all be correct.
That's I think that's like the worst, right? Well, at least for those bigger like your case you're talking about here, which is what we're familiar with, like you would have some library help you with that, like the optimistic update syntax query it will handle that for you, right? Whereas useOptimistic, probably it's just like smaller. The way I'm using it anyway is for smaller specific components where they have some state that they're expecting, and then you get the nice UI, and if something goes wrong, it's automatically reverting, and you can just click that action again and see if it's going to work again. You know,
maybe there's some you have some kind of feedback displayed in the interim, but
it depends on how you're doing it. Definitely
the specific setup. useTransition in general has been like, there's been people talking about it, but there is kind of like this. I think doing this, it's easy to talk about when we talk about like how easy it is, but I think that there is a little bit more work here that we're kind of saying needs to be done all the time. How do you kind of balance that trade-off in kind of putting this concurrency problem into the developer's lap explicitly a little bit more? Because I think like it is another concern here, and there's like a balance that needs to be struck.
That's
Have
fair.
like when do you and maybe I've asked this question already, but like how like where does it feel like it's worth kind of trying to reshape how we think about UIs to like do this? Should we always just be in this mode and this is our default way of thinking, or is it like we put this hat on when we have a problem that seems like it needs fixed?
And you're always building something that's talking to the API. So anytime you're creating a loading state of some sort, probably there's some feature that's better, like a suspense boundary or a transition, depending on if I'm transition, or if you're creating an error state, maybe you should be using an error boundary. All these declarative options that handle this for you. And same for useOptimistic. You don't need your optimistic state and then set state back on failure, you know?
Right.
These examples, for sure.
Yeah. Do you feel, this is kind of off topic, but when you're using like websites, do you find yourself often kind of like when you're interacting with them, are you like, do you get into that mode where you're like, oh, these guys are using the new transitions, or they did a lot of work historically to make this feel like they weren't, or is it like I'm just a web user, I don't
I think yes. I was like looking at this app. I'm like, wait, this is a really nice loading state. How did you do that? Oh, okay, it looks like this, right? It could have been like this, but I think those cases where you notice it's not where it should be a transition, you'll see the UI like flicker of some sort and doesn't match the update from the server. So there's like examples of this in documentation. And actually, I wrote a blog post just today preparing for this podcast. I was like making this combo box.
Oh,
Without a transition, the search in the combo box, the options like jump around, right? Because it's not in sync with the actual async function doing the search. So
Yeah.
those are the examples that you can feel, okay, this is kind of jittery, probably should be using a transition, or for the right terminology here, using an action.
We'll be sure to have a link to the post if we can get it wired up. But yeah, like I'm trying to think of a use case where, like, a recent use case that I've run into where I probably should have reached for one of these and I didn't, because I feel like it's easy to kind of always think about the form components. And I'm particularly trying to think of any examples that aren't like purely based around web requests, because I think that when we talk about these, we're always just like, all of the examples are always like the server is slow, right? There's always like, or the network is slow or whatever. Do you have any examples where you've used any of these for something like else, like system stuff, or like, you know, like a systems API that may not be super responsive, or anything else outside of just like network or, you know, like upstream delay?
Well, I think for the version of these features which suspended components or asynchronous calls, that's when you need it. But then you have the other aspect, which is for rendering optimization. So,
right,
which is what we already had in 18. So it depends on which.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the rendering optimization is like,
it's more niche. You don't encounter doing that as often, I think. Whereas the 19 APIs, they really can replace a lot of your complex code, like in everyday code.
And like even people working on apps that aren't like, you know, it's not like this data comes back and I'm doing hundreds of UI updates a second, and like this thing needs to be like, I don't know, like you have some kind of stock trading app or something. I think in those cases you like really would care about non-blocking rendering performance, but like,
or lists,
like
filtering
huge
lists,
exactly, like giant tables and stuff like that. Like those, I think that those do come into play. But I just anecdotally, I feel like, the impulse is correct. It's like, no, like everyone has this problem where everyone's doing web stuff, like async calls, and, you know, like we're writing web apps. This is everyone's got this problem. But yeah, like there's like I feel like I'm always hunting for a good example where it's like, no, this is like, we want to have this kind of like async feel, but it's not just because of network. Like there's something else interesting going on here, like with system hardware or something that could be slow.
Well, you can. I mean, transitions work for rendering. If there's like, let's say you have a processor problem, maybe something is not running. Transitions will also let you track the state of that. So I suppose
like,
that's it.
You'd probably use one for something pretty cleanly, like requesting like mic access, like those kinds of things. Like when you open an app and it's like, you know, I need to access the microphone or the webcam or whatever. You could probably do something pretty clean there.
There's a lot of options. The more you play with them, the more you realize how many cases this could work for.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, is there, I guess, kind of on that note, are there any specific like aspects of this that have kind of surprised you while coming up with this talk or experimenting with these new patterns in particular, that you kind of like have opened your eyes a little bit?
I think just how they all kind of intertwine. And I was like reading the old React V18 announcement. Like it says there, even in the announcement there, like, oh, in the future, we plan on using this for data fetching.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, so it's all coming together and it all has the same components that all kind of behave. I mean, it's a declarative way to think about what's important, what's less important, how do your loading states look like, how do your error states, and it all just works in this one API, you know? That's really fascinated me recently, how they have the same API, or the components function the same but can handle different things.
Are there any particular tools, or like something as simple as like a lint rule or something that happens at runtime? Like, is there anything you found here that really kind of helps push you in this direction, or makes it easier to interface with these new like hooks concerned with concurrent rendering and optimistic updates and transitions and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, the reactive tools are great.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't use them, probably you should be using them more because they're great.
Yeah.
There's like new features, like I think you can toggle suspense boundaries. You can see server components.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you can profile performance, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And now with the compiler, you can also see what components have been automatically memorized by the compiler. So for sure, the reactive tools.
Yeah, the active tools are pretty good. I feel like every time I open them up and I'm in there, I'm like, oh, this is a neat new feature.
Yeah.
I find something new every time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's always. Is there anything else, I guess, kind of on the talk, or anything else in particular you wanted to touch on here?
Well, I can maybe talk a little bit about the inspiration. So I was like doing some work in my consulting job, and I was building. Actually, I was building an autocomplete component or a combo box, and we were using Aria Kit, and I was like playing around with Aria Kit, looking at the examples, and I found this example which was like Next.js. I was like, okay, what is this? This is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't see the code because it was like premium.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, interesting. I'll just play with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that when you selected something, it wouldn't actually update the label right away, because the way the router works in Next.js, you have to wait for that update to happen. If it's like a search param, the search param will trigger, and then it will re-render the page, and then it will update the search param. So that means that your select is going to be delayed, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this is a very common problem a lot of developers face when it's not a real problem, it's just the way it works. And developers face this and get confused, like, how do I fix this? And in that case, I was like, I really want to make this example better. So I started talking with the creator of Aria Kit, and hey, I have this idea. And I read this part about in the useTransition docs about exposing action properties, and I had never tried it. And I was thinking, maybe I can see if this would work for this case. And that was the trigger. And I realized, okay, you can actually expose action properties just like the form component does with the form action, but for your own reusability. And that allowed me to kind of fix this example where it would be smoother. So basically, that's the story. And I really wanted to build around that because I hadn't seen that pattern done in practice before.
Do you see it everywhere all the time now? And you're like, oh, this, I could fix this. Like, this is the...
I think it's a little bit, as you're getting used to new patterns, you don't always see them, right? You're like, maybe. But then as you progress and you start using something, then you all of a sudden, you realize where you could make changes. So that's why that's like the basis, or one of the things I'm touching on in the talk, because I want to showcase how you could build something reusable with actions or transitions. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I feel like that's as good a transition as any. We do like a quick round here. On that note of like getting used to new patterns, what's your favorite UI pattern overall that you think most devs overlook?
Of course, I'm going to be influenced by my current work, and I've been working with server components recently, as I do, and just using the React.children and those APIs to create some sort of wrapper for server components. That's very interesting because you can all of a sudden, it's like a puzzle. You can do some sort of UI update based on the contents of a component without actually knowing what's there. And for server components, that means you can keep your data fetching on the server and such. And you don't have to optimize this, but it's fun to try. And in the client side, maybe there's better options like context or render props, but yeah, it's a cool pattern for server components.
What is the last library you tried just for fun?
Redwood SDK, the new Redwood. I tried that. Yeah, I completed the whole tutorial. I really recommend that. It was really long and very detailed and really good.
Yeah.
So definitely lets you try out and understand all of the features. So it's like a more natural and simplified way to work with server components and React 19 and all of the things that you maybe already know from Next.js, but you don't have the same rules and conventions if that's something that you maybe don't like, which I know some people don't like, right?
Yeah, and I was very impressed with the new Redwood docs as well. I mean, I think they have the advantage of it being kind like a clean slate and stuff, but they're a joy. They're a joy to go through for sure. Is there a tool or extension you couldn't live without right now?
Well, maybe you know what I'm going to say. Cloud for Copilot agent mode. So I work for enterprise. We use Microsoft, and that's why I use GitHub Copilot. And I might be wrong, but it seems like all of these features from Cursor already are available also in Copilot. So it works for me. And it took me some time to get into the whole AI development flow, and for the tools to be good enough as well to actually be useful in your like day-to-day work. But now I can't live without it anymore.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see now that OpenAI's got the new model out that Cursor can like use with the CLI. I think this will get a lot more interesting. Like this was like yesterday as we're recording, so like we may we'll see who's like I don't know. It's so hard to like get good. Get a good barometer of like how well this is actually working for devs, because like everyone's stories are like, oh, I use this all the time. Some people are like, I can't get it to do anything other than logs, and it's just like, we'll see how it progresses. But
well, I'm happy I got into the correct flow here, and I'm able to work more efficiently and more productively.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'm glad you found the path that works. Cool. All right, that was all I had. Thank you for joining me and chatting about components. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Of course. Have a good one.